Hello to all you lovely and wonderful people. In today's video, I am walking you through a step-by-step on how to create a watercolour spooky Halloween wreath. The type of paper that I'm working on today is 300 GSMs of cold pressed watercolour paper. The tooth of this paper is nice and smooth, so when it comes to using fine liners, which you'll see I will be using quite a lot of, it will make working with them a lot easier. To create the wreath shape, I eye up the centre of the page and then awkwardly using this compass, I make a circle. You can draw around something if you would prefer and if you don't have one. And then I roughly just measure to see if it is central, and it is, so awesome. This is going to look a bit odd, but I am making a few incredibly rough scribbles where I want to place the main designs around the wreath, so I can see if I'm happy with the overall placement of everything. I am adding pumpkins and a witch's hat, a coffin and a ghost for the main elements to this wreath. But of course, if you want to try and create your own spooky wreath, you can add whatever takes your fancy. Now that I have worked out the placement of everything, next is sketching the designs in pencil first. I'm starting with this simple little ghost. And then next is the pumpkins, which made sense to me to add to the bottom of the wreath. And I decided to add a couple of pumpkins, one tucked behind the other. I'm not going for a super realistic look at all by any means. If anything, it's sort of like children's book illustrations because that's what I enjoy doing the most. Then tucked behind those two pumpkins, I'm adding a creepy coffin. I couldn't quite decide whether or not to have a gravestone or a coffin, but I wanted something within the wreath that made sense as to why the ghost is there. And then the last main design for this wreath, I'm adding a wonky kind of style witch's hat that will be surrounded by little mushrooms, which incidentally look very odd when I'm sketching them out, but bear with me, they do end up looking better than they do right now. With the main sketches completed, I am going to form the blank spaces around the wreath with creepy, gnarly branches. So this is hopefully when everything stops looking so odd. I'm now going to go over everything with a fine liner. For the majority of the time, I'm using the 08 black fine liner to go over the main designs, but then I'm using the 01 for all the intricate and smaller details. When creating the lines for the coffin, I'm making sure that they're not too straight and rigid, making sure they're a little bit jaggedy so that it looks like sort of rotting old wood. I'm going to start speeding up the footage a little bit here because it did take quite a while for me to do this coffin. I'm a bit of a sucker for all things whimsical, so when it comes to the stalks of the pumpkins, I'm making them all twisty and twirly to create that look. Now it's time to hopefully turn those rather odd sketches of mushrooms I did previously into something that is a lot more recognisable to actually being a mushroom or toadstool. I'm just adding a few around the main designs to fill out the wreath really, and purely because I think toadstools and mushrooms are cute. For the witch's hat, that incidentally I'm getting strong Room on the Broom vibes from, the same rules apply as with the coffin. Don't worry about your lines being rigid or perfect. In fact, for this kind of thing, your illustrations will look better for it. When I added the ribbon onto the hat, I ended up making a bit of a mistake. So that's nothing though that a little bit of shading can't mask. I add a few more mushrooms or toadstools, whichever you prefer, around the witch's hat. And then I add a couple more to the other side of the witch's hat, which I felt were needed because then it made it feel a bit more balanced. For my little ghost, I had a last minute change of heart, and instead of giving him a happy smiley face, I gave him a little cute shocked face instead. So that's my main spooky designs done, and now I'm just going to go over and add some texture to each of them so that they don't feel so flat before adding watercolour paint. And to finish off the spoopy vibes, I wanted to add some spider's webs, of course. Incidentally, this one I did think ended up being a little bit too big, and in hindsight I would have preferred it had it been a bit smaller, but it's done now. And I add a second cobweb underneath the witch's hat to again balance out the wreath and make the space underneath the hat not feel so awkward and empty in comparison to the other side of the wreath with the pumpkins and the coffin. Even though I initially sketched out 2 faces on the pumpkins, I only ended up making 1 jack-o'-lantern because I think it looked too busy with the 2 faces. And now for all the twisty branches, which are really easy to create. You just make lots of twisty, gnarly lines, overlapping each other, and just keep building on them basically. I just keep adding more branches wherever I feel like they need to go, but the problem was knowing when to stop. I then thought it'd be a cool idea to add some twisty vines coming from the pumpkins on the left-hand side of this wreath, sort of wrapping around the coffin and then into the wreath itself. And now I'm almost finished with the fine liners, but the last thing is adding texture to the wood panels on the coffin, which I'm using my finest black liner for. And now we're finally on to painting. The paintbrushes that I'm using are Da Vinci Cosmotop Spin synthetic paintbrushes in size 6, and I think the small one is a 0, but I can't quite tell because I've used this paintbrush so much that I've actually rubbed the number off of the paintbrush, so I think it's definitely time for me to invest in some new ones anywho. The watercolours that I'm using are from Daniel Smith's. I am using, I think it's Burnt Sienna and Quinacridone Burnt Orange, Paynes Gray and Buff Titanium. As always though, anything that I have used in today's video will be listed in the description below in case you're interested. For the coffin, I'm using a light wash of a mix of Buff Titanium, Paynes Gray and some Burnt Orange. And then once I've left that wash to sit for a little bit, I add the same mix that I've used before to add some extra depth and texture to underneath the planks of wood on the coffin. For the overall look to be more cohesive, I'm using the same oranges that I used for the pumpkins, also for the leaves, and for the ribbon on the witch's hat. I wasn't intending to use green anywhere else around the wreath, so I decided against it. For the hat, I'm giving it a light wash of water first, and then I'm dropping Paynes Gray into said water, moving the paint around wherever I want it to go, and again letting the wash sit for a short while, but not letting it dry completely, before adding some more Paynes Gray to add texture and shading, and so it doesn't end up looking flat. For the little ghost, I don't need to add much at all, seeing as he's white, so I'm just adding a very diluted mix of the Paynes Gray wherever I feel that shading is necessary. For the stalks of the mushrooms, I'm using an incredibly light wash of Buff Titanium, and then for the same reason as before with the leaves, I'm using the same oranges for the mushrooms. Just chucking some paint on the heads of the mushrooms, not overthinking where it goes, and letting watercolour do what watercolour does best. The pumpkin behind the jack-o'-lantern was still looking a bit flat, so I added another layer of paint to darken it, as it's supposed to be in the background, and then I add some more shadow to the sides and the bottom of the coffin. With pretty much all the painting done, the only thing that's left for me to do now is add some colour to the ribbon on the witch's hat. And then just when I thought I was almost done, I decided that'd be a good idea to finish off all the spooky vibes by adding a colony of bats to the top of the wreath. So that's it, and here is my spooky Halloween watercolour wreath. I hope you found the video useful, and if you decide to create one yourself, then please tag me on Instagram so I can see your wonderful creations. Let me know what you think in the comments section below, and if you liked the video, then please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, then please consider subscribing to my channel and helping this little channel grow. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you soon.